afternoon. My name is Louise van Rijn. I am in this role as the convener of African Leadership Week, which is an initiative to mobilize a community of leaders who are committed to a better future, and leaders in Africa. And we do see African leadership as a gift to the world. And every single time when I talk to people about African leadership, they say, well, tell me what you mean by African leadership. And that's why we've invited the man himself, Dr. Reuel Khoza, to this conversation today. So why am I saying the man himself? Well, firstly, he is an African leader who has been acknowledged as a thought leader by Thinkers 50 last year, because he's been inducted into the Hall of Fame as an acknowledgement for his contribution to the field of leadership. He's the author of many books. The two books that I want to specifically mention to you is Attuned Leadership and then Let Africa Lead, which is why I'm saying he is the man to lead us into this conversation. Dr. Khoza is a renowned businessman. He has been chairman of many large organizations. He's absolutely committed to a more just and equitable society, South Africa specifically. And he is been on many stages around the world. So we feel incredibly privileged to have him with us this afternoon. And Dr. Khoza and I had agreed that how we're going to handle this conversation is it's going to be a conversation between me and him, but as a start, but we're also inviting everybody to be part of this conversation. So we agreed that if anybody has a question or a comment or something that Dr. Khoza says that you think, I wonder what he means by that, please post your question or your comment or your reflection in the chat so that we can bring your voice into the conversation and you can help us shape this experience. So I'm going to start in a minute by asking Dr. Khoza the first question, and he's going to respond, and we're all going to respond. And then in about half an hour, 45 minutes from now, we will go back into small groups. It might be different small groups to just kind of make sense of what we've heard so far. We'll come back, we'll continue the conversation. So that's how we're going to run this afternoon. And I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start by asking Dr. Khoza to say, do you think it's possible to define this idea of African humanism and Africa's unique contribution to the space of leadership, Dr. Khoza? What would your answer to that question be?
I believe it is possible to describe, perhaps even to define the concept of African humanism. Humanism, it's a worldwide philosophy, but it finds manifestations in different places, in different ways. Ubuntu is both a philosophy of life and a worldview. It is a comprehensive mode through which people express themselves from their particular vantage point. Western humanism actually opined that that man was the ultimate measure of humanity. African humanism, by contrast, is actually quite religious. It has a God principle. I'm saying religious, not meaning Christian or any of the mainstream religions, but there is a God principle in African humanism. There is a force beyond whoever might fancy themselves to be kings or leaders or whatever they might fancy themselves as. And for that reason, I believe there is a unifying force. Now, in what way does African humanism differ from, say, other manifestations of humanism? It is characterized by what you might call communalism. In other words, the group kind of predominates as compared to the individual. where the likes of René Descartes would say, I think, therefore I am, essentially saying that I am almost enough in myself. I don't need dependence on any other human beings to express myself as a human being. African humanism would argue that umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. In other words, I am because you are. You are because we are. We are an interdependent and consciously interdependent species. We belong to one another. Where we are concerned, 2 + 2 does not equal 4 necessarily. It may equal infinity if we understand the architecture of where some of the key elements of African humanism. I mentioned communalism, granted, but there is a lot more that characterizes it. Caring, for instance, there is an insistence on caring for one another, particularly for the infirm. There is an insistence on sharing. There is an insistence on being as compassionate as one is passionate. There's nothing wrong with one being passionate. In addition to being passionate, it behoves you to be compassionate, particularly if you are in a leadership position. There is also an insistence for interdependence being a superior value to independence. I know that as we grew up, I'm a man of 2 worlds, Western and African. But from my Western vantage point, I was told you must be fiercely independent. When I went to Harvard, that was also emphasized, that independence is a much greater value than interdependence. Don't depend on anybody. You can be you, and you might be sufficient to yourself. And I took issue with that. That's when I actually began to want to research more into the concept of Ubuntu. Now, I tried to propagate that concept even as a young director at one of the bigger banks, not the one that I'm chairing currently. And my mentor said to me, Khoza, business is not Ubuntu. Business is not a democracy. I paused for a moment and asked him the question, if it is not a democracy, what is it? And for the first time, he had to think a little bit. And I said, I can see you looking for the vocabulary to rebut what I've said. So if it's not a democracy, it is in fact an autocracy. And then the debating lines were actually drawn. And then I went on to say to him, particularly in the 21st century, or as we head for the 21st century, because it was the late 20th century, you're going to deal with complexity. And in dealing with complexity, you cannot have all the answers. Even as the group chief executive of this bank, you don't know everything. In certain respects, in fact, we could teach you a few things. So please understand that even though I argue business may be a democracy, I am not gainsaying the fact that ultimately the buck might have to stop somewhere. But I am saying that leadership does not reside in a given floor on top of some building. It may actually be virtually everywhere in the organization, depending on the issue at stake. Now, why propagate seeing things from an African vantage point? I think essentially, well, there is a proverb or an idiomatic expression that says, until such time that the lions have their own historian. Everything to do with hunting will extol the hunter and not the lions. So for that reason, I tried to delve a little deeper into understanding the concept of Ubuntu and the concept of leadership therein.
So, Dr. Khoza, you said a lot, and I think it's quite provocative for us who are interested in creating a better, more just and sustainable world. And I would love to hear a little bit more around. So Africa, as you said, the stories have never been about Africa as a contribution, or has rarely been about Africa as a contribution. It's been much more about Africa as a beneficiary. And where you and I are very much aligned is, yeah?
So, not so much as a beneficiary as being on the receiving end. Being a beneficiary, I will rejoice in that, but being on the receiving end of slavery, being on the receiving end of being colonized, being on the receiving end of apartheid, which was, politics of oppression and economics of exploitation, was not pleasant. So African leadership in the South African context, if you like, is informed by, amongst others, those historical precedents.
So there's a few people who have now asked the question, and I've heard that proverb about the lion and the hunter, but for those of us who need a bit more education, Dr. Khoza, can you just help us understand that proverb better?
It's essentially to do with what I've just mentioned. We have different histories. If you're talking Africans as essentially the indigenous Africans, we are products of colonialism or being colonized. We have a history of being enslaved. We have a history, a more recent history of being at the receiving end of the apartheid system. And for far too long, those that came from elsewhere, and even our own compatriots, given the fact that, in terms of the culture, they come from a dominant culture, arrogated to themselves the responsibility to define us as Africans. And that expression that we've just referred to actually says, let those who have been at the receiving end also define themselves, and thereby sort of even out there was the environment for making contributions.
So you remind me of a quote that someone sent me. I don't know whether you know this quote, but this is a Steve Biko quote that says, "The great powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military look, but the great gift still has to come from Africa to give the world a more human face."
Very much so. I'm a product of that era. Steve Biko was 2 years my senior, and we were both members of the South African Students Organization. Now, like everything else, there's nothing absolute about an African worldview. There's nothing absolute about a Western worldview. And particularly, for those of us who have had the fortune or misfortune of studying both here and elsewhere in the world. And my two most senior degrees are actually from British universities. And unless you are somewhat careful, by the time you emerge the other end, it could be nothing but a westernized zombie. So, but there is a sense in which if you go there with a view to learn and understand relativity, you actually become essentially an eclectic human being who relates better to fellow human beings because you have seen both worlds as it were. So Steve Biko was right that Africa or Africans, it behoves them to humanize the world. But there's nothing absolute about that. There are others from the Western world that will actually humanize the world. I am personally a product of American missionaries who gave me the opportunity to peep into Western civilization from a fairly early age. So yeah, that quote is was very significant, particularly during the time when South Africans were highly polarized. But if you're talking about South Africans today, it might actually be less pithy, even though it won't lose its significance.
So Dr. Khoza, you are in that phase of your life where you are focused on legacy and contribution, I think, from what I can hear. And I'm curious to know if you had a magic wand and you could infuse South Africa as a starting point with the ideas that comes from Ubuntu and African humanism and this idea that interdependence is more important and as dependence, and together we can do so much more. What do you think that the impact would be on business if we were actually able to infuse our business community in South Africa with these ideas, which is not currently in most organizations the predominant narrative?
I think the impact, the effect would be immense. I emerged from a situation that was a lot more transitional. Got into boardrooms and you found you were perhaps the only one, or you were the only two in the boardroom that had a slightly different pigmentation. South Africa's excessive dalliance with tapping into the wide segment of the population for leadership in business, for leadership in other walks of life, has actually disadvantaged us a great deal. If you could actually tap into a wider pool, first in terms of developing the brain power without discriminating, you could actually have had a much bigger pool of leadership, black, white, colored, Asian, than we currently have. Even today, the leadership, the so-called leadership class, is essentially male and white, and that needs to be broadened. The views of other people who may not necessarily be male and white might actually broaden the understanding and add to the synergies that flow from many, many brains working together. It doesn't matter how brilliant you may be, you have a number of aspects that might be defined as blind spots. And those blind spots can only be diminished by you opening up to those who are somewhat unlike you, who might actually have experienced the world existentially differently from you. And I want to believe that if we could open up that way, South Africa will be the much richer for that.
Thank you, Dr. Khoza. You've said a lot of things that I think most people are kind of thinking about and making sense of. So I want to just invite people on the call who want to respond to what Dr. Khoza has said so far. Grant, you've said a few things. Maybe you want to unmute and just share your thoughts and questions, and then we can invite a few other people. And then Reuel has also put her hand up. Well, actually, let's start with Reuel. Let's not go to a white man, but let's go to a beautiful black woman. Reuel, please put your video on and tell us what your question is.
Thank you, beautiful African woman. Thank you so much, Louise. And Dr. Khoza, thank you so much for today. Thank you for making time. Thank you for the honest, humble, and transparent delivery of, your speech, I guess. You mentioned, as Louise said, you mentioned a number of things. I am 38 years old. I basically did not learn an African language in school. I didn't learn about apartheid in school. I basically picked up, I think, 3 books about Steve Biko and a couple of others to learn about what truly happened. And what I found in South Africa is that in our quest to have these honest, humble, and transparent conversations, people oftentimes get irritated and sometimes aggressive on summits in the past. And I think I have grappled with, the 400 years of colonization that you mentioned versus the 30 years where it was all supposed to turn around overnight. Yes, we have been, I don't even want to call us victims, but most of us have hated the corruption, the bullying, and everything else that has happened in the marketplace. I think political analysts are forecasting a coalition government going forward. Do you think that we will ever get to a place where people like me are taught the true history of this country so that we can honestly contribute towards how, yes, it matters, but we're not prejudiced towards anyone because of it, because we were not really directly impacted by it? And the reason I'm asking this is because I feel like, as Louise touched on it, there's a lot of war that is happening in particular in the marketplace that we are not aware of. And we are basically the victims of all of this. I think that, there are always 3 sources of power in any nation: the government, business, civil society. Civil society took down the apartheid government, and now we've had business and government at war for so many years. Where do you think that true reconciliation is basically possible, giving you that perspective of how I view South Africa in the context of who I am?
Yeah, Refilwe, and thanks for actually asking your question located against a given background. May I just start with your, to a degree, lamenting the fact that you have not learned an African language. That's a handicap, because the most effective way of delving into anybody's world or worldview is through their language. I said to Wayne and the colleagues that were with me in the breakaway group that I think it would be good if we could understand each other in the various languages as well. I said to Wayne that I'm also a farmer of some description. I farm somewhere in the Mpumalanga lowveld. The thing that made me successful was not so much the technical aspects, but the fact that I actually found myself in a predominantly Afrikaner community. And my father had said to me, wherever you find yourself, son, you may be in a leadership position or in a followership position, but you must have a measure of intelligent ignorance. That was his philosophical way of saying, be in learning mode. So when I got there, first I subjected myself to be in learning mode. And secondly, I spoke to them in their own language. Ek praat suiwer Afrikaans. Maar my buurman het vir my gesê dat ek boek Afrikaans praat. Dis suiwer, maar dis boek Afrikaans. And then I tried to adapt to the local sort of colloquialism. And in virtually no time, because I could just, I could dip into that culture using their own language, I was able to relate to them in a manner that was equi-beneficial, and virtually no time I was a member of that. Now, Reuel, I'll give you a few idiomatic expressions or proverbs in the African language, just to indicate to you that perhaps by not speaking any one of those languages, you may be losing out badly, and you might like to begin learning an African language. Reuel, we have been given, or we have received a gift, which is a very, very good name. So I'll start by giving you an expression that actually extols interdependence. In Sepedi or Setswana, the expression is essentially the same. Ditau tsa go tlhoka seboka di šitwa ke nare e tlotsa. A pride of lions that refuses to cooperate cannot bring down even a limping buffalo. I believe it's a fantastic African expression that actually teaches huge lessons. So Reuel, yes, try and learn some African language. Motu ke motu ka batho ba bang. Kgoshi ke kgoshi ka batho. So the first one is I am because you are because I am. The other one says there's no such a thing as a king without vassals or followers. Now, all of these are embedded in the cultural archetypes of Africans. But your question was, are we likely to be able to come up with solutions? My response to you is that we have no choice in the matter. What Louise has started some time back and is continuing with is a very, very valiant attempt or endeavor to making sure that we depolarize, to making sure that we get to know one another's worldviews, to making sure that we align in search of realizing a common vision, that we develop a commonality of purpose. And with people like you, Reuel, Louise, and all of the people that introduced themselves when we first started, I believe we will be able to resolve our issue. Right now, we may be going through a situation where there's no dominant party, and we have to have alliances such as we have. It's part of the vortex that will actually spew us the other side of this confusion, with us perhaps sobered out and knowing that we actually will only win by way of valuing one another.
So thank you, Reuel. Thank you for Dr. Khoza for that question. I want us to kind of have a little bit more in the large group, and then we're going to go back into small groups. Grant, you have a provocative question that you want to ask. Do you want to share that with all of us?
Sure. So I suppose I was busy typing away there. And it's just reflecting on Reuel's comments, because I think they're very profound and moving. I feel that there is probably the need to create the space for a consciousness in South African society around the biases and prejudices that are ingrained in our entire system. And those, as a white male, born in the early 70s, I was the top of the pyramid in that structure, and obviously there was all sorts of rank within that system. And a lot of the system, that those falsehoods and lies perpetuate today, and to my mind, often unconsciously from white South Africans. And I suppose the question that I was busy drafting is Dr. Khoza, how do we create the space within society for a consciousness around those issues to emerge in a way that is constructive and positive, whereby we can connect on our humanity and hopefully say, how do we all belong to the system and create a system that is going to work for all of us multi-generationally? And then just one quick, more direct question relating to your comments about the need for improving the racial composition within, top management and boards. Is certainly my experience of business is that a lot of that top management and boards are choosing people who are schooled in the Western paradigm of shareholder primacy and individualism. And I don't feel that necessarily those appointments are going to people who think like yourself and who are, I suppose, who come from a paradigm of African humanism and that type of thinking tradition. I think it's less common than the alternative. And I just, how do you see that being resolved? Because I think that's the only way we're going to create a business that actually starts thinking more system level and multi-generational. Those are my thoughts. I don't know if those are useful comments.
Grant, I think those are wonderful thoughts. Even though you did not ask many questions around them, but they're wide-ranging, they are profound. I think they call for a great deal of time of sharing views. How do we create the space? And how do we get expansive, having created that space? I think we have to do just about everything there is to do about depolarizing our communities, depolarizing our own nation. And it starts with our institutions. First, the schooling. The second, even going to church. Doesn't matter who you want to worship. I've been, brought up in the Christian faith, but I do ask questions that actually challenge the Christian faith and even challenge my God. And all of those we can actually discuss in church, and not necessarily when we are listening to the preacher who will be talking to us extra cathedra, but once we get to know that we actually belong together. Thirdly, I believe where the politics of our nation are concerned, they need a lot of sanitizing. In fact, they need to be bleached. The dominant party likes talking about our people. In language, you can actually destroy a lot without being even conscious. What do they mean, our people? If you delve a little deeper, their people are essentially people who were hitherto oppressed, Black people, if you like. And that phrase alone can actually be so caustic. It can also be so acidic. If as a white South African, 5th generation South African white, and somebody spoke about our people in a tone that excluded me, I would feel excluded. And that actually sort of deepens the polarization, which we should actually work hard to eliminate. So let the parties be inclusive. Our own so-called liberatory party, as in the ANC, must learn to be a lot more inclusive, not only ideologically, but even in terms of racial depolarization. I think it is important that they get to know that. The predominantly white opposition party also has got to learn to be a lot more sensitive, even with the use of language, even with the inclusiveness that actually likes to include only tame natives. And those that ask questions, one way or the other, find themselves teft off. They need to come to the realization that, in fact, they must have those who can stand up to them intellectually, who can stand up to them in debate, belonging to that party. And it's all to do with the challenge of depolarization. It's all to do with cultivating a South Africanness that is truly inclusive. Not inclusive in terms of slogans only, but even inclusive in terms of the subtler nuances of actually doing away with things that may actually be polarizing in a manner that is not crude. Making sure that we fight racism, but we also fight meta-racism. Racism that comes clothed in niceties of complexities.
You're making us all think deeply. Khoza has put her hand up, so we want to create an opportunity for her to say something, and then we've got a question from Nevin in the chat, and also one from Dumisani. But let's hear from Khoza, and then we might go to the other people. Khoza.
Thanks, Louise. Ntate Khoza, thank you so much. I liked it when you said that you come from the era of the stiff because, and we're talking now African leadership and how exactly it is that it translates to the generations that are coming. And my question is on how can then the understanding of Africanness and the leadership concept of Africa be translated to particularly the people that are sort of up and coming young politicians. We're looking at the current ones that are coming up. The Julius Malemas are taking each other on, and as you've just put it rightly so, the ability to debate and hold each other accountable at a place where we can actually have discussions instead of actually biting at each other's head. How do you know, your kind of leadership, your kind of people that you've gone and you've done these studies can come back and say to these young ones like the Ntantalaxes of this world, you know, you probably have something there that we can work with, but how then do we navigate it to a point where it actually serves the purpose that it should from the heart that it is? Because what I am observing from where I'm sitting is that there's obviously passion to make a certain change in and around our communities. However, how it's channeled, it's probably not learned, because maybe there is that gap in terms of the leadership ability, skills, and understanding that is not there, and it's not available for those kind of people, where they obviously have got a huge pull. There is a whole lot of young people that are following them, and now we are sitting with a dilemma in our country where it's all going haywire as a result of not having that kind of guidance. And so now we need them to come and say, how do we then make sure that Rona, who are upcoming, we understand how to do it the African way? Thank you.
Khoza, thank you very much. I think perhaps you have touched on one of the key issues that actually faces us as South African today, because there is no shortage of activists, and I believe it is good to have activists. But activists who tend to be polarizing don't help the cause. Now, what might we do? I believe those of us who have, if you like, seen the light, who are enlightened, who can do the analysis, like you've just done the analysis, should actually cease to be armchair critics and enter the fray. So you, Khoza, with that understanding, I want to believe that you are a member of a fairly substantial group of intelligentsia, black, white, colored, Asian, members of the South African intelligentsia. Those of us who can be catalytic agents should actually begin to catalyze things amongst those and encourage them to get off their high horses of criticizing coldly, criticizing without entering the fray, and begin to enter the fray, encourage them to enter the fray. Why? Because members of the intelligentsia will give answers that are thought through. Unlike those who are not well-read, those who have not had the fortune of getting educated. In fact, some of the pain that we suffered as a nation was allowing not popular leaders, but populists to enter, to step onto the plate, if you like, step onto the platform, ill-prepared. You cannot, in the 21st century, or as you go towards the turn of the century, allow yourself to be led by somebody with about 5 years or 7 years of education, because they'll pretend they're leading without the requisite tools. And those tools are essentially concepts. They step onto that platform with baskets that are empty of concepts, or the kinds of tools that will enable them to think. You cannot think without the requisite concept. It's not possible. That's why we went through 9 years of darkness as South Africans, essentially because people who were not equipped pretended to be leaders. We must make sure that the intelligentsia fold up their sleeves, enter the fray, and provide the requisite guidance and leadership to a point where we have, if you like, critical mass. So, Khoza, fine name. I wish I had a name like that. I mean, in Shangana will be Rulani and not Reuel, which is a Hebrew name. I mean, it's old Jewish. But my father was a preacher, and I think when he knew I was about forthcoming, he just paged through the Bible and get me the strangest of names. But I do have a number of African names that I don't want to bore you with. But Khoza, you meant to be peacemaker, but not just peacemaker. You also meant to be a unifier. So I will suggest enter the fray and invite others in the wake of doing so.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, Khoza, a peacemaker, and Dr. Khoza. We're going to create an opportunity for people to go into a small group conversation again, and then come back with further questions. And it's just an opportunity to make sense of what you've heard so far. So I'm going to pause the recording. Let me pause the thing back on so that we don't miss anything.
This meeting is...
And we want to create an opportunity for anybody who wants to share anything you want to share from your breakout group. Any questions, reflections, you can do it in the chat, but we can also just unmute yourself, and we would love to hear from you. So Sarah Davids.
Hello there. Yeah, thanks. I'm taking this opportunity, one, to share a little bit about the group, and two, to maybe pose a question to the broader group. A lot of what we discussed could probably be summarized under the terms of getting more social cohesion and working towards social justice, all of things which need another 2 workshops to unpack the terminology and the varied understanding. Some of the things that I think that I also raised in the small group was, and I'd probably like to hear Dr. Khoza's view on this, is our definition again of what is South African and what is African. And I speak because in my street, there are people born, there are people's parents who come from Tanzania, there are people's parents who come from Mozambique and Eritrea, but their children are all South African. So going forward, we are building a very different South Africa than what we had before. And we're missing a step to celebrate the contribution and the diversity and the added culture that is there, and that it's not only, so to speak, isiXhosa, isiSepedi, etc., etc., but that every grouping and every culture has the value and the as a value add, and that essentially to create the leadership, we need to find the common ground and the thread with which to grow a South African identity, which is core to all leadership forms in whatever sector we find in society. So I'm just interested to hear your points on that, Dr. Khoza.
No, thank you very much. I don't know if I should respond now or a little later. Perhaps I may as well. Take Johannesburg. It's as metropolitan, or if you like, African metropolitan as can be. I think for me, the most wholesome point of departure is to look upon other human beings as human beings. The divisions that separate us, the cleavages that separate us, may they be religious, may they be ethnic, may they be racial, should actually melt at the recognition of the fact that we're all human beings. Yesterday, I attended a freedom celebration organized by the Jewish community in South Africa. And they, at the session, actually launched a book called Mensches in the Trenches. A mensch in Yiddish or in Jewish is that which is essentially human in humanity. And if that is our point of departure, we'll be able to relate to another and value the life in other people. And you're talking about Tanzanians, you're talking about Kenyans, you're talking about even Nigerians. What I believe is important is to drop the stereotypes. South Africans have a stereotype of virtually all Nigerians as either crooks or drug smugglers. And that's not true. That's in the nature of stereotype, over generalizations. So amongst other things, we should also learn to drop our prejudices, prejudging, and approach fellow human beings as human beings. In the language of the philosopher Martin Buber, instead of treating other people as I-it relationship, it should be I-thou. In fact, I respect you as much as I respect myself. I take you as seriously as a human being who could contribute to enhance my humanity as I may if I choose to. And the idea is to choose to. So yeah, who is South African? The boundaries are actually artificial things stemming from 1884, Strauss, the scramble for Africa. If you go into history, that's what actually happened. If you're talking about the DRC, what separates them from us is essentially artificial boundaries. If you talk about Zimbabwe, same thing. The vendors of South Africa and the Shonas of Zimbabwe actually almost unite in language, but because some pseudo historians who was racially motivated said you don't belong together. Some pseudo leader who said I believe in fragmentation and I make it my business to fragment humanity. We actually have to do something counter to that. Unite humanity as opposed to perpetuate its fragmentation.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Dr. Khoza. Dr. Khoza, that thought of leaders as people who facilitate collaboration across differences is a big challenge for us. That's one of the kind of core ideas for us with this initiative, is to say, how can we learn how to lead for unity rather than fragmentation. And I do think that is a gift from Africa to the world, is if we can truly get out, but we first have to learn to do it ourselves before we can give it as a gift to the world. But maybe that's a provocative proposition for us. It's the idea that African leaders know how to collaborate across boundaries, we know how to partner, and we know how to lead for unity.
Yeah.
I see Nevin has a question as well. So Nevin, we're going to give you the opportunity, and then we're going to hear from Wayne. But first, Nevin, Pastor.
Okay, thank you so much, Program Director, and really appreciate the inputs that are raised by Dr. Khoza. And from our group, we also appreciated what he has raised in terms of Ubuntu, the issue of mono imunhu hi van'wana vanhu. Na ku tisa miehleketo le a yi raisaka ya ku hi tlhontlha ku yisa mahlweni to assist the nations. We have learned that whenever you are on top, don't take away the ladder. The people that have interpreted your dreams to be there in that position must be valued, must be respected, and must be loved. And this is the kind of conversation we are learning from the doctor, and that we appreciate, that we value, that if all of us, especially people that are in leadership, can carry forward, we can have a better and a progressive nation. I also subscribe to what John Maxwell said, that everything rises and falls within leadership. So I would also like to present the input for the doctor to take it further as my observations, especially in Africa, that most of the African leaders that are in government, they tend to forget the promises that they have made to their voters once they are in government. They tend to forget and begin to be selfish, work for themselves. I believe Africa has a lot of resources and potentials, but how do we deal with that stereotype that once you are sent into the leadership of the government, you forget everything that you have promised your voters, so that we can have a leadership that provide delivery and improvement into the lives of society. Thank you so much. Inko.
Oh, thank you so much, Nevin. I think the metaphors you use are very, very powerful. You know, if you use a ladder to climb to the top, don't kick it once you are right on top there. In fact, by way of extending that metaphor, you might need the ladder one day when you actually have to come down. But I wanted to add to that metaphor the dictum, which is said to be African, but I believe it could have come from anywhere. There are those who claim that it actually came from African Americans. Lift as you rise. And a true leader does not just rise and become a leader in limbo. As a leader in limbo, you will wither and wane. You cannot be standoffish as a leader. You should actually lead from within. If you want to lead from the front, don't be too far ahead of the rest of us, lest we shout and you can't hear us. So there is a sense in which lifting as we rise as a dictum is very, very important. If for whatever reason you have had the fortune of rising and progressing, in the wake of that, think of those that might need your guidance, that might need you being a catalytic agent in their development, and make sure that as you rise, you also lift. And as you use the ladder, let other people actually use the ladder to join you wherever you may be in some higher place. So Nevin Akensa, Munu, Imunu, Hibanwanabanu, Hosi na yona hosi, Ihosi Vanu.
Thank you, Nevin. Thank you, Dr. Khoza. I see we have Wayne has his hand up. So Wayne, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes. Thanks. The group session just makes me realize more that dialogue and learning about each other, there's so much power and strength in the people in this room. So, Reggie and Mujeta and how do you know how to say it? Sunisani. Lovely input, lovely reflections on how the work that they're doing is so impactful. And it led us to a discussion, Dr. Khoza, that, do we have hope? Do we see the prosperity that our nation has so much potential of unlocking, becoming a reality? Because that's where, if we have that hope, we can drive towards that outcome. And it gets me wondering, if President Ramaphosa didn't have the political dynamics at play right now, we can see he's trying to do fencing with one hand tied behind his back. He's having a tough time. But would he be able to exercise the leadership without those constraints and being fettered as he is? Would we really be able to see the leadership that is required to unlock the potential to allow us to be what we can and should be as a nation? One worries that that's missing. Does he have to step up the plate from a moral courage perspective? One senses he's putting his foot into that door more and more. But when does that leap come that is required? After the December elections?
Yeah. Wayne, I think that question is so central. What is genuine leadership? What is effective, wholesome leadership? I guess it comprises a number of things. Knowledge and knowledgeability, passion and compassion, caring, as we said earlier on, understanding exactly where we are at this historical conjuncture. In other words, understanding that in the 21st century, you're going to deal with complexity. How do you handle complexity? You're going to deal with the world as a neighborhood. How do you handle globalization? You are going to work with opposing forces, heavy ideological forces. Are you prepared to actually weigh up the pros and cons of all of that? But most importantly, there's one observation that was made by Winston Churchill, who led, when things were actually pretty tough in a war situation. His observation, Wayne, is that you can have all of the things that I've spoken about, but unless you have courage, and in particular, the courage of your convictions, you are not going to be an effective leader. Effective leadership actually behoves today's leader to be competent, to understand and subscribe to moral conduct, but very, very importantly, to be courageous. The world is perishing, as one British philosopher put it, not for lack of astute or even bright people, but for lack of people of courage. And if you ask me, and I've tried to say this a number of times to my own president, and by the way, we were together at varsity. He was 2 years my junior. I even taught his first wife psychology way back in 1974. So we belong to each other, and whenever we meet, we actually speak in a dialect, either Venda or Shangaan, because somehow when we speak in those kinds of languages, we tend to believe we're beating our drums to a common God. So I do say, in fact, he must stand for something. And boldly do so and let the chips fall where they may. That's what leadership is about. There was a time when he was more popular than his party. And it was, that was a golden opportunity to actually say, those who see the world somewhat differently and are meant to be destructive, go find yourself a home elsewhere and not in this party. That's boldness. That's courage. That's courage of your own conviction. Crucial. Have everything else, but lack that courage. In particular, the courage of your own conviction. You might as well retreat and go home.
Dr. Khoza, you're speaking words that many of us have been feeling. I wish we could have our president on this call. Wayne, did you want to respond to that, or was it just that thumbs up enough?
No, lovely stuff. One just senses the courage is a bit latent. It's there, and you're right. He had brilliant opportunities to exercise that, but I think the political dynamics were just too complex. And I would rather have him inside the circle than out, because if he was out, I would hate to think of where we would be right now. So yeah, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes, but if you can just whisper to him, pull that moral courage card out and get going, because we're running out of time.
And there are many people who would be right behind him when he acts courageously. George, I see you unmuted. Did you want to share your thoughts or ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all. Good afternoon, Reuel. Are you well? You look well. I'm pleased to see you again. And also to you, Wayne. In our group, I try to make the point that there's a sense of despair in the country because we're 30 years down the track and yet we have not moved to where we wanted to be. And my explanation for that, or my effort to try and explain that, is that since '94, a lot of things happened which should have happened. Namely, the TRC dealt with amnesty. It didn't deal with the emotional healing of the wounds of the past. And in our constitution, the roadmap is there. The roadmap very clearly says, deal with the wounds of the past. So we have a constitution, but we don't, and we don't have an emotional settlement, and we don't have a socio-economic program. And to my way of thinking, that are the three legs of the potjie, and we don't seem to attend to it. Great seeing you, Reuel, and everybody else. Thank you very much.
George, words of wisdom as always. We have not done much to heal the wounds. And we are not doing much to restore human dignity to people. And in certain respects, we actually denude people of their dignity inadvertently. I'll use just one example. I'm no politician. I'll rather be a business person who actually is a citizen who cares about other citizens. Let's take the challenge of providing houses. If somebody came to me and I was sort of in a destitute state and said, Khoza, I want to house you, I'll feel somewhat insulted. I don't want to be housed. I want to be enabled to have a house. In other words, help me build myself a house. Don't house me. Housing is what you do to other human beings. A house is what you build for yourself, retaining in the wake of that dignity. People who are housed are denuded of dignity. People who are enabled to have a house that they can turn into a home have their dignity intact. So what I believe one could do, even with something as simple as that at a psychological level, would be what the former the president of the US, Bill Carter, is actually doing through the Habitat for Humankind. You get to those who would like to have an abode. And he said, I'll provide the requisite infrastructure and you are going to put equity, even if it is sweat equity. The sense of ownership is enhanced. The sense of dignity is enhanced. And that way, in fact, you go the extra mile, even in terms of the number of units that you'll be building, as opposed to using some cookie cutter that says we will haggle people into those little units. And we are, in fact, helping them that way. And these are issues we have to actually debate, as opposed to saying, well, you shall be housed. Help people provide houses for themselves. That way they retain their dignity.
Reuel, I'm so pleased you used the example of housing. Just now I told the group that I don't know how well it's realized, 100 years ago, we had the Spanish flu in the country. And at that stage of the game, and now the same type of squalor, the same type of bad housing situation still exists. So in 100 years, that problem has not been resolved in South Africa. Now, if that's not an indictment, then I don't know what is.
Yeah.
So I think, thank you. Thank you very much, George. Thank you, Dr. Khoza. We're coming to the kind of wrapping up our conversation. And I want to wrap it up with a conversation around Dr. Khoza. I'm going to take the spotlight off as well so that we can all just see each other. I want to tell you about our dream for African Leadership Week, and which is part of our dream for creating a community of leaders who are going to work together to create a more just and equitable world. And those of us in South Africa, we're going to do that in South Africa, but we also have many people from our brothers and sisters from other African countries who want to join us in this conversation. We're going to do that by convening and hosting and being in conversation and having tough conversation, and we're going to do the work of healing our wounds from our past so that we can create a better future. And today's conversation is part of that. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the chat. And as we're about to end this conversation, what have you taken away? Are you inspired? Are you motivated to be part of the solution? Because that's what we're hoping for. So this community is going to be a community of leaders where we're all going to feel a sense of belonging. And we're going to co-create that for each other. We're not going to wait for elected officials to make that happen for us. We are going to reach out to each other and we're going to practice African humanism. And we're going to care about each other and we're going to share and we're going to believe in the power of interdependence, and we're going to remind ourselves that 1 + 1 can become infinity rather than 2. And we're going to have elders like Dr. Khoza who will continue to hold us accountable, but we're not going to wait for the Dr. Khozas of this world. We're each going to step up and lead. And we're going to put the spotlight on leaders who are already doing amazing work so that they can inspire us. And we're going to create opportunities for us to collaborate across boundaries. And we're actually going to practice what we preach. We're going to stop talking about it. And we're going to definitely look for opportunities to collaborate. So I'm seeing Wayne on the call. Wayne and his team are doing amazing work around water. Water is the next big issue for us in South Africa and in the world. And they want leaders from in every community, every river, every water source in the country need assistance. And we as citizens are invited to play our part. Earlier today, we had a conversation with someone who runs the National Mentorship Movement, and they're bringing people together with lots of experience with young people who don't have as much experience, and they're sharing knowledge and skills. Many of you know that we've been running Partners for Possibility, which is about creating business leaders and school principals and bringing them into conversation, into relationship with each other so that they can share their knowledge and skills. And both of them will become more compassionate and more conscious leaders as a result of doing this. So today is part of a much bigger vision for a South Africa that we can all be proud of, and the South Africa of our dreams that will require leadership. So we hope that joining this conversation today is just the first of many conversations. And Dumi, you've been sharing lots in the chat and we've not actually heard your voice. So there you go, Mr. Coach, our best friends in Joburg. Dumi, I'd love you to just share some of what you've been sharing lots of thoughts. You've got such wisdom. We need to hear your wisdom. And Dr. Khoza, Dumi is in my life one of the people who have been living the values that you talk about. So he's been every time you're in his presence, I'm touched by that. So I look forward, Dumi, for you to play your leadership role and to hold all of us accountable. But we'd love to hear your thoughts just in response to today. And then I'm going to invite you. One of the values for us in Africa is we appreciate each other. And so I'd like you, I want to hear a few people just share your appreciation for today, appreciation for Dr. Khoza, appreciation for the other people that you're in the room with, in this beautiful spirit of generosity that we know so well. So we'll start with Dumi, and then I'm going to keep my eyes open on who else want to say something. So Dumi, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Incredible work. And from the days of being on the board, of working together, Louise, and the amazing work that we've been doing. And then Dr. Khoza is a mentor of mine. We've been on a journey a long time, and his work informs a lot of my work now. I coach using Ubuntu coaching and Ubuntu intelligence, informed by a lot of his work. So I feel very much at home, and I'm always learning and getting re-inspired and re-fired up listening to Dr. Khoza and yourselves and everyone on the call here. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. What I want to say is that we need to tread and be gentle with each other as we engage. And this is what Ubuntu and humaneness is about. It's about co-creating the spaces for us to show up in our greatness, because we all have incredible gifts. What this platform does is give us space to recognize each other's brilliance. In the isiZulu greeting, Sawubona, I see you. When I see you as you are and not the.
Have we lost Dumi? Dumi, we've just lost you there. This is the problem with the rains and what's happening. Sorry, Dumi, your voice went away. Try and speak again. No, we've lost Dumi. Can you just try and speak again, Dumi? No, lost him. Okay, so who else want to, with such wisdom, Grant, I'm with you. Every time Dumi speaks, I'm inspired by his wisdom. We want to hear just a few last final thoughts, and then we will end with Dr. Khoza. We're going to ask him to give us some patkos, something that we need to remember as we go back into the world to go and lead in our little corners. But we want to give 3 or 4 people an opportunity to respond to what you've heard this afternoon, to acknowledge and honor Dr. Khoza, and don't hold back. We've got some amazing speakers on this course, and we know you've also, we're looking for people who are either going to put their hands up or unmute their phones. And Reuel, this is your opportunity. You've been wondering about saying too much, but we do want to hear from you. There you go. And Grant, we're also going to put you on the spot, because if people are not going to speak, then I may have to call on you. I may have to volunteer you. So Reuel, consider yourself volunteered.
I'd need a few seconds to just consider what I'd like to say. I'd like to give other people an opportunity as well. Thank you so much, Louise.
Okay, but we do want you to say what's on your heart. Anybody else? There you go, Dr. Khoza's not. Grant.
I just reflecting on one of the comments that was heard here about healing, and I agree the imperative of healing. And I suppose looking back at the TRC, I feel one of the sadnesses of our journey is we never created the space for meaningfully understanding the injustices of our system. And so I feel my experience is one of the impediments to a meaningful healing process taking place within the country, and I speak as a white South African, is I'm not sure as a white South African, enough of us have got an adequate appreciation for the extent of the injustice that the system perpetrated over 400 years. And I feel that there's a lack of, generally, there's a lack of contrition, authentic contrition in my experience. And I think that might be a crucial component in terms of really being able to connect and find the healing that our system needs. And so one of my suggestions is, how do we create the space in school systems, in tertiary education systems, but as well as in the corporate landscape, to create that awareness so that we can really build, the authentic commitment from all of us to be part of our healing journey.
Grant, you do have a position on one of the ways, so maybe this is your opportunity to help us get more people interested.
Are we talking about I see Reuel's hands up, so I've got to get out of
come in a minute, but so you have had the experience through Partners for Possibility where you saw what happens when we bring business leaders into schools. So maybe you want to just say something about that experience.
Okay, so I suppose for me, coming a white male of relative privilege, and I suppose just being exposed to the Partners for Possibility program, where it's a year-long program. This isn't like, go into a township community briefly once off, have a lunch at Wendy's and then go back. And if you're lucky, maybe go to the Hector Peterson Memorial. It's a year-long program where you get exposed to communities that are very, very different to my own personal experience. And it was a life-changing one for me. And walking into a school where there's 70 children in a classroom, the closest thing to a swimming pool is the puddle on the way to the classroom, and it's just different. It's a very different life experience, and Dr. Khoza touched on this when he spoke about our radically different life experiences and the importance of embracing those different experiences as we seek solutions to our challenges. And PFP certainly was, for me, gave me an opportunity to really embrace that experiential learning, and it was life-changing.
Thank you, Grant. It's always wonderful when our participants share their own experience in their own words. So Reuel, over to you.
Thank you, Louise. Grant, I just wanted to express appreciation for your comment. And I guess what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think is the reason why approximately 30 years post apartheid, you still believe that a lot of white males do not have an appreciation for example, my experience. So we could play golf together. I might report to you when doing a deal. But I do know that starting a conversation regarding this need for healing tends to instigate some form of irritation or sometimes even aggression from people like yourself. So respectfully, I do wonder whether spending time with a community somewhere in Alex gives you that appreciation. I don't think so, because in one of the talks last week, I mentioned that when you deal with, for example, a typical 38-year-old African female from Limpopo versus one from Soweto, two vastly different experiences. Yeah, what do you think? And I don't want to put you on the spot. I find that I get along with people like yourself as long as I do not bring that conversation up. And most of the time we get along in religious circles. However, having not had this platform, we wouldn't be talking about this. But now that we are, how can we get the conversation going? It's a pity Dumi got cut off, but he seems to be a bit more educated about the psychological aspect of this healing journey that we need to start. So Brené Brown mentioned she's in the US, and she mentioned that it's a lot more difficult for the victim. And again, this is just for the lack of a better term, Dr. Khoza. It's a lot more difficult for the victim to bring up the conversation regarding an appreciation for past hurt and justice moving forward. Most of the time, it's expected and advisable that it comes from the other side. How do you think, now that we've been on this platform, you would maneuver around something like that?
Very briefly to respond, because I think it's a wonderful question. I'm hoping, Reuel, where if we got to know each other, we would get on and we could have tough conversations. So when Dr. Khoza was chairman of our organization, there was a leadership program called Leading for Deep Green. And part of that journey was genuinely understanding each other's journeys, life experiences, and connecting at the deepest, most personal level. Unfortunately, that program ended shortly after Dr. Khoza left, and it was the biggest life-changing experience of my life. And I suppose for me, why is it still here? Is because I used the history, the Western version of Dr. Khoza's Lion story as history is written by the victors, and I think it's intentional. I think it's deliberate that there are so many people that are not conscious of the extent of the injustice of our past. So I think the system is structured in a way that we don't want everyone to be aware of the past, the extent of the injustice, and the extent of reparations that would be required to achieve social justice meaningfully, because that is a really hard and tough conversation. And so we avoided it. And people, I believe, overall, generally, white South Africans are profoundly ignorant of those experiences. I'm not going to pretend to you that a year program, I'm not trying to be funny, I've never been hungry, okay? And so my experience cannot compare to the experience of a Black South African in our past. I've never been hungry. And you read Sia Khaleesi's book and you realize just the extent of the parallel universe of ignorance that I was raised in. And I suppose I do feel, though, is committing to a one-year program, I suppose creates at least the space and the intent that I'm understanding the extent of these issues, or I want to understand the extent of these issues, and I'm committed to being part of a solution, which includes giving up my privilege at a cost to me, not for me, not even for my children, but probably for my grandchildren. and I'm absolutely happy to pay that price.
So what I'm excited about is that Reuel and Grant are in a conversation, because that was one of my hopes for this conversation this afternoon. I do think, Grant, I think you and Reuel owe each other a cup of coffee. I hope that will happen soon. So thank you for making that happen, the two of you. Dr. Khoza, thank you. We loved I said to him earlier today, it feels to me as if we're going to get the opportunity to sit at the feet of an elder, and we loved it. We hope today is the first of many conversations with this community. Many people couldn't join because of many reasons, but they will be watching the video, and many people will be inspired by this. We want to give you the final word, that, you know, what are those thoughts that you want us, as we are leaders who are committed to a more just and equitable South Africa and Africa, give us some marching orders as you say goodbye to us.
Louise, thank you very much. I must thank you again for introducing me to the panel of assessors that finally decided I should be allowed into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. It was a very, very uplifting experience in my sort of latter days. I have you to thank. Now, colleagues, there are a number of things I would like to say, and I'll say them very briefly because we've been at it for quite some time. I would like to start by appreciating the cautionary words articulated by Dumi, that we should tread with caution, whatever we do. It's very, very easy to be offensive. It's very, very easy to be strident. Very, very easy to be sort of holier or even greater than thou in trying to seek solutions. Tread with sensitivity, tread with caution, as Dumi was about to actually, I know he would have elaborated a lot more than I could actually ever hope to. Tread with caution, tread with sensitivity, be responsive. Whenever you have to provide some leadership, whenever you have to provide some advice. I would like for us to take that as a takeaway. The word contrition has been uttered twice or thrice today, but in particular by Grant, that we don't do reflection enough. We don't do introspection enough. And in the breakaway group that I was in, I actually tried to define introspection. Introspection and reflection have to do with looking into your inner self, granted. But it also has a lot more to do with thinking about thinking. You may think you have been thinking, but you have not thought enough about your thoughts. So in reflection and introspection, those are the challenges. Review even your thinking, not just your deeds, not just your acts, not just your actions. Review your thinking as well. Reflection, introspection also entails thinking about thinking. I just wanted to mention something about humility. I mentioned something earlier on about my dad saying, you know, wherever you go, make sure that you are guided by a sense of intelligent ignorance. Even where you are knowledgeable, make sure that you actually position yourself in learning mode. That ties up with one characteristic or trait that I learned from Walter Sisulu. I have said this before to those that I've had occasion to talk to. When I first met Walter Sisulu, extended my hand to greet. We greeted, and I introduced myself, and he said, "Don't." And I almost froze because I didn't know why he was saying to me I shouldn't. And he said, "But I know you, and I'm young enough to be his third born." And he says, "But I know you." I said, "But data from where?" And he said, "When I was in jail, I read no less than 3 of your articles, and I said to myself, there's hope." And then we meet 9 months later. I introduced myself again because as a younger one in the equation, you take it, he meets so many more people. I tried to introduce myself. I said, "But we met 9 months ago, and I asked you not to introduce yourself because I know you." Such humility. And my takeaway from that brief encounter was that, genuine leaders are humble. And I coined the phrase, standing at the gate of leadership, genuine leadership, will not be the angel Gabriel, but the angel humility. You're not going to enter that kingdom arrogant and haughty. Humble yourself. If you allow it, just before I close, could I asked President Mandela, the late President Mandela, our founding father, to write an introduction to Let Africa Lead, focusing on Ubuntu. If you allow it, I would like to quote you what he said in the foreword. I quote, "All big ideas are simple. Ubuntu is a simple, big idea. It asserts that the common ground of our humanity is greater and more enduring than the differences that divide us. It is so, and it must be so, because we share the same fateful human condition. We are creatures of blood and bone, idealism and suffering. Though we differ across cultures and faiths, and though history has divided rich from poor, free from unfree, powerful from powerless, and race from race, we are still all branches of the same tree of humanity." Close quote. And I thought those were wonderful words of wisdom on the concept of African humanism. May I conclude by letting you know that one Professor Mushenkondo initiated an idea which I believe will be a wonderful idea for the year. And he invited me to join him in coordinating, researching, and inviting writers to make contributions to a publication by end of this year, done along the lines of the Oxford series, but titled Agency, as in aspects of our Constitution: Agency, Freedom, and Justice, would be published as a national reference. The substrap to that work will be Citizens in Conversation, Seeking Solutions. And I want to believe that this platform that Louise, you so kindly coordinate and so effectively coordinate will continue to address the idea of agency, freedom, and justice, because the three belong together. And we will keep conversing as citizens in search of lasting solutions. Thank you very much once again for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Khoza. Dr. Khoza's just quoted from this book. You can see we're carrying the book with us. So I want to leave you with his words, which he wrote in 2015 on an aircraft on his way to Davos. And today, so many people have talked about this idea of Africa Leadership Week as a kind of Davos for leaders in South Africa, but for everybody. So this is Dr. Khoza's words. He said, if not us, then who? If not from Africa, then whence? If not now, then when? If not for Africa and humanity, why not? Let Africa rise to this quintessential challenge. It is our date with destiny. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And please let's stay in touch. Next week, we've got Professor Tuli Madonsela, and we will continue to build our community of leaders who are committed to a more just and equitable society.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for meeting. Thanks.
We have
Brilliant,
recorded
brilliant.
it. We will share the recording once we've
Okay.
loaded it in the system.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.